Fuck!
Hey folks, in the last video I did an engine oil flush in the Basket Case BMW. In this video we're moving on to the transmission. My car has an automatic transmission and I'm willing to bet the transmission oil hasn't been changed in a long time, or maybe it's never been changed at all. So I'm going to change the oil and filter. While I'm in there, I'm also going to install an upgraded pressure regulator valve from Transgo. Plus I'm going to install a transmission oil cooler. Alright, let's get started. Okay, so obviously the first step in replacing the transmission fluid is to drain out the old fluid. However, before I do that, I want to make sure the fill plug on the transmission will come out. Because if I drain out all the transmission fluid and for some reason the fill plug doesn't come out, I'm SOL. So let's check that. The fill plug is on the left side of the transmission. It takes an 8mm hex key. For this guy I can use my ratchet wrench. The drain plug takes a 6mm hex key. Whoops. Wow, that fluid is dark. I bet it's never been changed. And this is what happens when you forget to open the fill plug on the oil collection bottle. Oops. But thankfully I have some of that stuff. Still, this is going to be a huge pain to clean up. Next up, I'm going to disconnect the lines for the transmission oil cooler. I'm going to be installing an aftermarket transmission oil cooler, so I need to splice into this line. Also, I want to get as much of that old transmission fluid out as possible. So, here we go. There's a special tool you can get for these quick disconnect fittings, but I found that a lot of times you can just use a crescent wrench. Make sure the crescent end of the wrench is just big enough to fit over the pipe, and then you can just press on the wrench to undo the mechanism. I'm also going to spray it with a little bit of penetrating oil. Hopefully that'll free him up a little bit. I'm going to need 2 hands for this, so I'm going to set you guys down. Okay, now it's time to remove the oil pan for the transmission. It has a whole bunch of little bolts all the way around the edge. Each of those bolts uses a Torx E47 socket. Let's see if I can actually get it in frame. There we go. I noticed a lot of these bolts have a bunch of dirt inside the little Torx part. I don't want to strip them out, so I'm going to hit each one with a little bit of brake cleaner. Like this. You get the idea. Okay, all the bolt heads are cleaned out. Now I'm going to loosen all of them, but I'm not going to remove them. Once again, it takes a Torx T27. These bolts should not be very tight, unless the transmission was serviced by an orangutan or something. Yeah, that came out pretty easy. Nice. Uh-oh. Okay, that's better. Alright, let me put down the camera and finish this up. Okay, all the bolts are loose, as you can see. Now I'm going to remove all of them except for the two middle ones in the back here and here, and the two corresponding middle ones in the front. I'm going to leave those 4 bolts in place to keep the pan from falling down and making even more of a mess than I've already made. Alright, putting the camera down again. Okay, so all the pan bolts are out except for the ones on the 2 ends like I talked about a second ago. I was worried that it might be difficult to remove the pan from the transmission, but check this out. Watch right here. Did you see that? This transmission wants to be serviced. Can't say I blame it. So now I'm going to remove those 2 remaining bolts in the back of the oil pan. The 2 bolts in the front are going to stay in place to keep it from falling down completely. But I'm going to allow the back of the pan to droop down, and hopefully that will drain the remaining oil into my drain pan, instead of all over the floor again. Wish me luck. Wow, this is turning out to be a really messy job. Anyway, I'm going to remove the 2 remaining bolts on the transmission oil pan and get that out of the way. Okay, the pan is off. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but my car has the ZF, or maybe I should say ZF, transmission. The pan on the transmission has a total of 22 bolts. Also, the gasket, which I think is the original gasket, is really brittle. Check this out. There's literally no plasticity in this gasket anymore. Totally brittle. Anyway, let's take a look at these magnets. You can see there's some gunk on them, but I don't see any chunks. It just looks like some goo, some dusty clutch dust maybe. But that's to be expected from a transmission with almost 180,000 miles on it. The important thing is that there aren't any metal chunks. If there were, then that would mean there's something seriously wrong. So hopefully it's still good. Also, I took a sample of the transmission oil, and it is almost black. This really needed to be replaced. I bet it's never been serviced. Removal of the filter is pretty easy. There are 2 mounting bolts holding it in place, one at the front and one at the back. They both take a Torx T27 socket. Then you just pull it loose. Also, I noticed one of the magnets from the pan stuck to the filter. That was odd. Alright, here's the old filter, and it is completely caked up with crud in there. I'm surprised the transmission even worked properly. Also, an Easter egg. There's the manufacture date, 31 October 2000. So now I know this transmission has never been serviced. Okay, according to the instructions in the Transgo kit, we need to identify the valve body to make sure the kit is appropriate for it. I didn't even know there were different valve bodies, but whatever. We need to start at the hole where the filter goes in, and then we come back here, and there should be a rectangular vent hole right there, and there is. So I think we're good to go. The Transgo kit comes with a couple bolts. According to the instructions, we're supposed to grind the heads off the bolts so we can use them as alignment pins, like it shows here. And after a couple minutes on the bench grinder, they look like this. Can you focus? Probably not. There we go. Anyway, the instructions also say these two pins need to replace two bolts on the valve body, here and here. So I guess we need to do that right now. Okay, I've got those two pins installed. There's one here and one over here. I think now I can remove the valve body, or at least the front part of the valve body that we need to remove in order to install the Transgo kit. So I'm going to put down the camera to do that because this is super awkward. Oh, I forgot to mention, about half of those bolts are Torx T27, the other half are Torx T40. I've already removed the T27, so the remaining bolts you see here are the T40s. Okay, so I loosened up those T40 bolts a couple turns, and now there's more transmission fluid leaking out. Man, this job is so messy. Okay, I'm down to one bolt right there. The whole valve body assembly is loose. But I'm letting some of the oil drain out before I remove it completely, because I'm pretty sure when that comes out there's going to be a deluge of transmission oil. It seems to be the common theme with this. Alright, the valve body is out, or at least the front part of it, the part we care about. Also, here are all the bolts. Well, all except for one. One fell into the drain pan. I'll have to dig it out later. Anyway, next step is to remove the bolts on that front cap. All these guys are Torx T27. Also, keep in mind, that cap is under spring tension. So when you loosen these bolts, that cap is going to want to come flying off. Just FYI. Okay, I have all the bolts removed except for these three. I'm going to carefully remove them a little bit at a time. Okay, there we go. Okay, the Transgo kit comes with the pressure valve, of course. Also, it comes with a spacer, a spring, and some O-rings and seals. First thing we need to do is install those O-rings and seals on the pressure valve assembly. Okay, now we need to get the new pressure regulator valve ready to install. Part of that process is installing the seals on the valve assembly. If you look at the valve, there are two grooves, one here and one here. that's where the seals go. And actually, if you look over here, these are the seals. Interestingly enough, after you install the seals, you're also supposed to put O-rings on top of them to compress them. Not sure what that's all about, but apparently they know what they're doing. The instructions also say to put some assembly lube on the seals when you install them, so I'm going to use some of this. There's one more. Alright, and last but not least, we need to put the O-rings on top of these guys to compress them. I'm making sure the O-ring is directly on top of the seal. This little guy is kind of a pain. There we go. Alright. Last but not least, we need to go throw this in the freezer. Theoretically, I should have done this before I pulled out the valve body. Then I could throw this in the valve body and put everything back together right now. But it's dinner time, so no big deal. Okay, let's replace that pressure regulator valve. The piece that we're replacing is here, inside here. If you look at this big hole where the filter connects, it's right in line with that. So we pull out this spring, and then we pull out the valve as well. Here's what that valve looks like. And the replacement, fresh out of the freezer, looks like that. Oh wait, I got it backwards. It goes like that. Oh, and don't forget to remove these O-rings. We don't need them anymore. Next we put in our orange spring. And last but not least, the metal spacer. Now we put this whole mess back together and put it back in the car. Okay, this valve body assembly is ready to install. One thing to keep in mind when installing it is to make sure this piece meshes with the selector lever. The lever should actually fit into this groove right here. And I'll show you on the bottom of the transmission in a second. Okay, here's what I'm talking about with the shift lever. Here's where the shift cable attaches to the transmission. It attaches to a lever that goes through the case. And then this part of the lever interfaces with that part of the valve body that I was talking about. So like I said before, it needs to ride in that groove right in there. It's important to get this right because if you don't, you won't be able to shift the transmission. Unfortunately, I made a mistake when reinstalling the valve body. It's funny because I talked about how important it is to get the shift mechanism correct. Then I got it wrong. After I assembled everything, I tried to shift the transmission and the shifter was bound up. So I had to take it back apart to fix my mistake. Anyway, let's continue with the project. Now we're talking. Okay, off camera I installed and tightened all the bolts. I triple and quadruple checked each one because I want to make absolutely sure none of them are loose. Also, I took the opportunity to clean the gasket mating surface with brake cleaner. I figure since the transmission filter is not in the way, it should be easier. And it was. I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but this is the rag I used to clean off the gasket surface on the transmission. And this is why we clean gasket mating surfaces. Installing the new filter is pretty simple. As you can see, it has two plastic tabs for the mounting bolts. Plus it has a round part that goes into the valve body. So you push the filter on, then install the bolts. Before I install the new filter, I'm gonna lube the seal with some transmission oil. Always lube it before you put it in, guys. Another thing I did off camera was to clean the transmission pan inside and out. During the process, I found this sticker that says you should never top off the transmission oil. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, I'm going to do a final cleaning of the gasket mating surface with some brake clean, and then we're going to put this on the car. A little trick I like to use on the pan gasket is to put some spray adhesive on it so it'll stick to the pan. When you go to install the pan, this will make your life a lot easier. I know some people have expressed concern about whether or not the gasket will seal properly, but this is something I've been doing for about 30 years now, and it always works pretty well. Anyway, let's install this in the car. Okay, all the bolts are installed and torqued to factory spec. This torque spec on those bolts is really light, so you have to be pretty careful with them. Also, don't forget to tighten the drain plug as well. Normally this would be the point where you refill the transmission oil and then you would be done. But in this job we have one more step, and that is to install the transmission oil cooler. So we're going to do that next. Speaking of the transmission oil cooler, I am not going to replace the stock unit. I'm going to keep the stock unit and then add on the other one as an additional cooler. I'm going to do that by cutting one of these lines and taking both ends and sending those to the new cooler. The way I'm going to route the hoses is I'm going to take this hose, which I think is the fluid coming out of the transmission, route that to the new cooler. Then from the new cooler it'll come back to here and go through the stock cooler and then back into the transmission. I'm doing it that way so that when the transmission is cold, the stock cooler will still be able to warm it up, because the transmission doesn't need to get up to operating temperature just like the engine does. If I did it the other way around, with the add-on cooler being second, then the oil going into the transmission would always get extra cooling, and that might make it take longer for the transmission to warm up. I think this line is the one coming out of the transmission into the cooler. Now, if it is, then this is the one I want to splice into. But I want to make sure before I cut this line. So I'm going to pop it loose from the cooler. Then I'm going to start the engine for a couple seconds. Only for a couple seconds. And see if transmission oil comes out of here. If it does, this is the right line. If it comes out of the cooler, that means it's actually this line. Alright, let's do that. Ah, what a mess. But at least now I know which hose I need to splice into. There's no going back now. I tried a few different mounting locations for the transmission oil cooler, but I eventually decided to put it right up front where the auxiliary fan used to be. I test fitted the cooler in the radiator duct and there was plenty of room. So I drilled a couple mounting holes in the support bracket and mounted the transmission cooler to it. I held a piece of wood up against the radiator while I drilled the holes to make sure the drill didn't punch a hole in the radiator. I'm also putting red Loctite on the fittings to make sure they don't leak or come loose. The transmission cooler is mounted to the support bracket using 2 bolts. You wouldn't think that it would be very secure with just 2 bolts, but it actually feels pretty solid. I also used rubber grommets to absorb some vibration. Anyway, here's a closer look at the transmission cooler. With the transmission cooler installed, it's time to make the lines for it. The stock lines appear to be 12mm inside diameter. That's pretty close to a 1/2 inch, so I'm going to use a 1/2 inch hoses for the transmission cooler. I made some hard lines using 1/2 inch diameter aluminum tubing. Those lines connect to the ends of the stock hose that I cut in half. And they wrap around the side of the radiator to connect to the new transmission cooler. Now that the plumbing is finished, it's time to refill the transmission oil. This transmission doesn't have a dipstick. You have to fill it through the fill port on the side. It needs to be filled in 2 steps. First, you fill it with the engine off until the fluid spills out the fill port. Then you start the engine and fill it some more until it spills out the fill port again. To pump the fluid into the transmission, I'm using an El Cheapo garden sprayer from the hardware store. Unfortunately, the nozzle on the sprayer was really restrictive, so the flow rate was very low. I removed the nozzle assembly and replaced it with a piece of clear tubing. That helped a lot. Finally! Took about 10 quarts of transmission oil to fill it up. Anyway, let's seal this thing up and call it a day. Since I had to start the engine to finish filling the transmission, I decided to leave it running and check for leaks. I don't see any leaks. So far, so good. No leaks down here either. I can feel the line getting warm. The cooler's getting warm too. That's pretty cool. Or maybe I should say, that's hot. One final detail. I need to make a bracket to hold up these pipes. Here's what I came up with. It's basically just a piece of aluminum strap with a couple pipe hangers attached to it. It'll bolt onto this mounting point right there, and it'll be basically like that. Okay, I need to do one last thing. I need to cut a relief in the side of the duct here to make room for these pipes so I can install the duct. After I modified the duct, I installed it. I also reinstalled the front end. The job is now complete. Here's what it looks like with the transmission cooler installed. I hope you enjoyed the video. Now I need to clean up all the mess. So that's it for this video. See you next time.